It may be 2024, but it feels like 2022 in Marvel's Snap, as the best decks in the game are Deadpool Destroy and Sera Control. Let's start with Deadpool Destroy, and this is a deck that I consider sort of a harbinger of good open metagames. When Destroy is a viable choice, or even a good one as it is right now, the metagame tends to be a lot more open because there are a lot of decks that are just a little bit worse than Destroy, and so when Destroy is a good choice, those decks are okay choices, which means that there is just a ton for people to actually play. Now, as far as the actual Destroy deck, I like this build. It uses Lady Deathstrike in order to deal with some of the problematic early game things that you may see currently, such as Lockjaw or Wong, although Wong is far less common. Lady Deathstrike still finds some seriously solid targets across the metagame right now. I also think that there is one other viable build to Destroy that I have affectionately nicknamed Dracstroy, and it came from the second place finisher in Lambie Series' most recent tournament. The addition of Dracula into this deck is a tool to make it so you don't have to high roll as much. You get to just discard your null to this Dracula instead of doing the ridiculous stuff that it would otherwise take for you to play a null and a Deadpool on the final turn of the game, such as X23. Now, I do think that despite the fact that these are only one card off, they do tend to play a little bit differently. However, my personal belief is that Destroy is fairly straightforward to play and snap with. When you are doing the thing, you simply evaluate whether or not your opponent can compete with what you're doing. And usually what you're doing involves large Deadpools, large nulls, and free deaths. Now, you are going to be a little bit vulnerable to some of the tech cards that exist, especially if your opponent is able to throw priority. An example would be Shadow King being very good against your large Venoms, also against your Deadpools. You can have Enchantress and Rogue be good against your nulls. You can have Shang-Chi be good against basically everything you play. There is some significant weakness to tech cards when you do not have priority. You are going to have to run that. However, this is a baseline strong strategy that is able to compete with nearly everything right now, and when uninterrupted, can be one of the absolute highest ceiling strategies in the game. Last week, I talked about how we didn't know yet what the best of the Miss Marvel, Zabu, and Tech decks were going to be. That family of decks includes multiple decks on this tier list, including Black Knight and Loki. However, I think Sera Control has established itself as potentially the best of the group, and for that reason, it's going before the others. Sera Control is able to establish points on the board and play a solid mid-range game, and is not reliant on drawing Sera to win. She's just a good card that helps you do what you were already doing, which is Zabu, Miss Marvel, good bodies, and tech cards. One interesting bit about this build of Sera Control is that previous builds of Sera Control, before the deck was as good as it is right now, were relying a lot more on theoretical power. And what I mean by that is cards like Angela, cards like Bishop, cards like Hitmonkey, and they were rarely the best shell for those cards. Sera Tech was rarely the best Angela deck. It was rarely the best Bishop deck. It was pretty much never the best Hitmonkey deck. And now we're in a situation where Sera Tech is no longer attempting to leverage those cards, but it's much better at leveraging Miss Marvel and Gladiator than it ever was at leveraging those. And a lot of that is because you can play them later. That is actually as simple as it gets. You are able to distribute your power where you need it, whereas other Miss Marvel Gladiator decks are playing them much earlier, making them much more vulnerable to opposing tech cards in the case of Miss Marvel, and you don't have to do that. That's actually the very simple reason why this deck ends up above the other decks in its family. It is so much more easily able to take advantage of the strong things that it does than those other decks are. And that is what makes it one of the best decks in the game. I consider Thanos Lockjaw still elite. I know several other people who do content like this have dropped Thanos Lockjaw down on their tier lists. Frankly, I just don't know what they're talking about. This remains a popular and powerful deck at high elo, although I will say it has lost some luster from when it was the only real option a few weeks ago. Thanks to the blob nerf, this is still an absolutely strong, incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous deck. Thanos Lockjaw is looking to play stones into Lockjaw to accelerate out large idiots, using Kyera to protect those large idiots, and using Scar to capitalize on having those large idiots. In the absence of a Lockjaw, it's looking to use Time Stone into large idiots and then use Scar to capitalize on those large idiots and Kyera to protect those large idiots. You kind of see where this is going. This is a deck that is built on doing things that are unfair. That is the entire premise of the archetype as it is currently constructed, especially with Lockjaw in the deck. The goal here is to set up a situation where you are likely to do something unfair, snap before you do the unfair thing, and hopefully get some cubes off of opponents who are unaware of just how unfair what you're going to do is going to be. Thanos Lockjaw has an extremely high power level and an extremely high complexity level, but fundamentally it does boil down to just doing as much unfair stuff as you possibly can given the constraints of 6 turns and 21 energy. Hawk Leech is an archetype that, in my view, is played much more commonly outside of the top 1 to 200 and much less commonly inside of it, but it is an extremely common deck to see when you are simply playing the game at basically every level other than that, and it is a solid deck. I think solid is the word that comes to mind because it's not overly unfair, it's not overly cruel, it's just a solid interactive deck that is looking to stop your opponents from doing things with Leech, but in exchange needs to make up that power by playing extremely powerful 4 and 6 cards, right? You have your Miss Marvel into Leech into Doctor Doom, for example, is an extremely powerful way to win games while also playing a very weak turn 5 card. This is an archetype that originally existed and incorporated Leech in order to make itself playable. You needed the Leech in order to get rid of the blob in your opponent's hand that would eat its entire deck and then make your Darkhawk terrible. Now it's just playing the Leech for value, and Leech is a good card to build around right now. It is one of the more powerful cards in the game, and Leech will, despite the fact that he results in a lot of 2-cube wins, raise your win rate and your cube rate because he also results in a lot of those games that you can only win with Leech. This is the kind of card that is key to the deck functioning, and if you are someone who just wants to play a good, solid, restrict your opponent's options control deck, this is definitely one of the premier versions that you can play. Speaking of Leech, the other main deck that is looking to leverage the little green guy is, of course, She-Naut, and She-Naut remains a compelling and powerful list right now. I am of the opinion that She-Naut is pretty okay, but if you're in the business of leeching, this might actually be my preferred list. It does have some major issues at higher levels of play, in that it tends to give the initiative over to your opponent. You don't have a lot of agency in your own deck, unfortunately, because your deck does very often require you to go to a turn 7 without playing anything on turn 6. Unless you leech them, it's hard to feel comfortable doing that, given the amount of possibility for them to completely turn off everything that you are doing with that limbo. However, when you can pull it off, you are nigh unbeatable. Not actually unbeatable, just nearly unbeatable. I think this deck gets a lot better the lower down you are, the less people are going to understand what you're doing, the less people are going to know to retreat when they actually hit those final stages of the game. But there are still ways for you to lose even when you pull everything off, because fundamentally what you are doing usually amounts to about 30 points. The Infinite plus She-Hulk, a Hulk plus She-Hulk, maybe a little bit of a soak in there. It's not overwhelmingly powerful, but it will beat the vast majority of stuff. And I think that is compelling when you think of this deck as a combo deck that also gets to run Leech. Loki, I think we can finally all agree, is no longer the best deck in its own archetype, as it has been forced to adopt the Zabu Gladiator Miss Marvel as its major shell. It ends up falling short to Sera in my personal opinion. However, the upsides of Loki still are immense, an immense amount of energy cheat, an immense amount of dangerous cards for you to leave on the board. But right now, it's my view that cards like Killmonger tend to be a little bit more valuable as a reactive tool. Cards like Mobius and the Sera deck tend to mean that that deck is favored into you. And so you end up in a situation where Loki is no longer the best deck in his own archetype, but he is still, I think, quasi-playable. Loki can be played right now, but I think most people would do better with the Sera Tech deck. However, if you are a Loki diehard, here is where I am at right now. I have been messing around with this for a little bit now, and I just really can't get on board with the Dino stuff. There's so much Shang in the meta. There's a decent amount of Enchantress and Rogue. I can't get on board with playing Dino right now if I don't have Cosmo in my deck, and I don't think I want to put Cosmo in my deck. And I can't get on board with the Iron Lad stuff either. So this is just a slightly modified build of the one I've been playing for a little bit now, which I will say the Vision, we finally got rid of it. We finally found some ways to get rid of it. I'm happy with that. And effectively what's happening here is we are really mimicking Sera control. The Enchantress is in here as well. We are just trying to be a solid mid-range deck when we don't draw Loki. When we do draw Loki, we try to cheat as hard as we possibly can with cards like Quinjet and Loki, of course, as well. And I think that that is a reasonable strategy and probably the best you can do with Loki right now, short of some amazing Thanos cook, which frankly, none of the ones I have seen have been overwhelmingly compelling to me. Hence, this is still the build of Loki that I would play and am playing. I was worried that Black Knight, once Blob was nerfed, would take over as the inevitable next top deck, and I was wrong to be worried about that. The fundamental inconsistency of Black Knight means that it is not one of the best decks in its own archetype. That archetype, of course, being Zabu, Miss Marvel, Shang-Chi decks, and it is probably the third best of them behind Sera and behind Loki. You could argue it's above Loki if you really wanted, but I don't think that's necessarily germane to how strong it is, because I don't think you can reasonably argue it's actually better than Sera. And the reason for that is, despite the massive power spikes, this deck tends to power spike in a way that ends up being a little bit win more. And I did want to talk a little bit about that concept. A lot of people talk about Scar, for example, as a win more, and that's not how I think of those cards in Marvel Snap. When I think of a win more in Marvel Snap, I think of winning a lane by like 17 when you needed to win it by 1. And this deck is a prime example of winning lanes by like 15 that you didn't need all of that power therein. And that happens a lot with this deck. When I think of win more in Marvel Snap, that's what I think of. And Black Knight tends to be a deck that does not distribute its power in the most efficient way. It puts a lot of power on the board, but they're very limited in terms of where it can actually go. And for that reason, they tend to be involved in, when I play this deck, a lot of games where it's like, all right, I won this lane by like 17, and then the other 2 lanes are like really close, and there's not much I can do about that, and I probably lose them. And I think that is the major reason why I don't like this deck as much as the other decks in its archetype. They are not hard committing to this high roll plan. Like, the instinctive way to look at Black Knight is to say, oh, it's Sera, but it high rolls higher. But those high rolls don't actually bring you more wins. They just bring you more points. And that's a distinction that I think is worth making. It's pet deck time. This is my current build of Anni Bounce. I consider it one of the best decks in the game right now. It is a deck that I have had immense success with. I think a lot of my climb this season has been because of this card. And yes, I'm still within the top 50 easily, and of course within the top 69 as always. This is a big reason why. It's a bit of a comfort pick, but I know there are other people out there who are, you know, sort of comfort picking onto bounce type decks. This is what I would play if you were one of those people. I think there are 2 major flex slots here. Those would be Iceman and Shadow King. That can be pretty much, you can pretty much have like 2 swap-ins here. Iceman can be Spider-Ham, and Shadow King can be Enchantress. Those are really the only changes I would ever realistically make. And you can sort of mix and match those as you like to see fit. So, for example, if you are playing Shadow King, you are a little bit pushed towards playing the Spider-Ham because of the way Shadow King interacts with the pig. I have opted for the Iceman just because I view his disruption as a little bit more important right now, but that is not a hard and fast rule. Those swaps can be made at your discretion. On to the combo deck section, and I think these combo decks are plenty viable right now, for real. Because of the prevalence of Destroy, you end up in situations where if you can play a combo deck like Hela or Living Tribunal, you end up with very favorable matchups in that context. I will say Living Tribunal much more favorable into Destroy, and is a big reason why I like the Lady Deathstrike build, because without Lady Deathstrike, you probably just die every single time to Living Tribunal. But with Lady Deathstrike, you blow up, say, a Mystique, an Iron Man, maybe both, who knows? And that is absolutely game winning given the amount of points Destroy can put out. However, looking at Hela right now, I think it's a solidly positioned deck. I know it is a reasonable one. It's a very good deck. One little new wrinkle that this now has is that Silver Samurai is almost always going to discard your own blob, which makes this deck a lot more understandable. I think there are a lot more targeted discards that we're specifically aiming at in this deck right now. We have Death for the Lady Sif, we have Blob for the Silver Samurai, and Silver Samurai is also how this deck gets a little bit of a chance against Living Tribunal blowing up an Iron Man, for example. You also get to randomly free farm Cerebro. There are some upsides to this deck for sure, and this deck is generally a solid one that I think is pretty underrated. I know that Shuri Enjoyer has posted the one deck that he's been climbing with, which we'll cover later, but I don't know how much people have been talking about the fact that he is also very much playing this deck on his way up to number 2 in the world. Hela is absolutely an option for good players right now, even great ones, and that does need to be respected. I think that this deck is legitimately underrated. In a world where people are playing a ton of Destroy, this is a deck that has a lot of free wins in it. Unless the Destroy player is playing Lady Deathstrike, which is more possible now that I did my video on why Lady Deathstrike is good in that deck. Like, I believe if you look at untapped Destroy decks with 500 plus wins, the best one is the Lady Deathstrike deck, and that is not a coincidence. I do think that there are enough free wins out there for this deck to make sense again. Now, that said, there are a lot of people who are also playing Seratech, so you have a lot of terrible matchups as well. I'm not saying I would wheel this out every single time. What I am saying is when a metagame gets polarized, like if you're somewhere where everyone is just playing Destroy, you can whip this out and collect a lot of free wins. Living Tribunal combos off so much harder than basically anything else in the entire game, and that means it is the ultimate over-the-top deck as long as it is not disrupted. I've seen a little bit of a resurgence in lockdown decks recently, so here is a lockdown deck for you to play. A very simple, very straightforward strategy. A lot of the upside that this deck has comes from the utility of Storm. Storm is a good card into both Sera decks and Destroy decks, so it is a card that is well positioned right now because, you know, those are the first two decks we talked about for a reason. Storm locking down those lanes makes it a lot harder for your opponents who are looking to do stuff on big turn 6s to actually win all of the lanes they need to. Storm's very, very, very strong right now. This is a deck that utilizes her very well, and that should be respected. However, that is, I think, the vast majority of this deck's power is Storm. Like, if you're not storming something, this deck is not competing with the stuff other people are doing. And that is a bit of an odd situation to be in. I think if you're not playing Storm on turn 3, when you play this deck, you should be playing another deck. And I think that is a weird spot for any archetype to be in. But when you look at it, it sort of makes sense, right? Because if you're not playing Storm on 3, well, you're just like a worse Darkhawk deck, aren't you? And if you are playing Storm on 3, you're like a significantly better Darkhawk deck. And I think that sort of dichotomy illustrates why this deck has the position that it does. Storm is amazing right now, but to build around it, you end up with this like 11 card, slightly worse Darkhawk mid-range Miss Marvel thing that other archetypes are doing better, but those other archetypes aren't built to run Storm, and Storm is your competitive advantage. Finally, I wanted to highlight the build of Shuri that Shuri Enjoyer is playing on his way up to rank 2 in the world. He was playing this and Hela, and I just wanted to highlight it because I think it's kind of the thing that most people won't have played against for a while. I know he's been playing this for like a month. He sent it to me like a month ago, and I was like, I don't buy this. And it wasn't very good then, but now that the metagame has sort of dropped in power significantly, you're not getting like heinously blobbed to death. This is a really interesting build of Shuri. However, I do think a lot of why he's doing so well with it is his own skill level. When you look at this deck on Untapped, there are about 500 games played with it, and it has like a 51% win rate, which if that's what he was doing with it, he would not be ranked 2 right now. So it seems very clear that this is a very complex and interesting deck to play. Despite looking like an easy deck to play, I don't think this is easy to play at all. So the reason I'm putting it here at the end is so I can say, you know, play at your own risk. It seems very clear that this is a very difficult deck to play, not an easy one. And I know people are used to thinking Shuri decks are very easy. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through all of that. Remember to like and subscribe. And of course, check me out on Twitch, twitch.tv/KMBestMS. And I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.